Thank you, Nina. Thank you, everyone at the museum and the curatorial program for this invitation. It's really a privilege to be part of this series and an honor to be here. So this talk has been advertised as exploring performance curation, documentation, and the archive. And I think as present and future art historians here, I think many of you are already abreast of the complexities and the current conversations around the different manifestations that performance documentation can take. So for me right now, what is of more interest than like types of notation or reperformance or what access to social media means in regards to liveness is how documentation in the archive can be integrated into institutions in a more holistic way. So at the kitchen, our present protocols for documentation are quite traditional in terms of photo, video, sound recording. But I've seen how documentation in the archive have been applied to notions of the value created around performance and performance history by ourselves at the kitchen as well as other institutions. And the particular anxiety that artists working in performance have towards these structures of value that are maintained and created primarily by museums, which, this anxiety grows alongside performance's presence within museums. These types of documentation also includes the language that codifies, such as a wall text or a label, information like a monograph or a retrospective that canonizes. Institutions of all kinds, but particularly museums, are in the service of preservation and typically deliver this dominant narrative. But of course, this works against the inherent disappearance of performance as well as the subjectivity of its viewers. Language in particular has an extremely conflicted relationship to performance and how it is translated and then made permanent. But of course, art history itself as a field is reliant on documentation in the archive in this way. So as a curator at a nonprofit that can still offer what I call kind of the hypothetical in opposition to the authoritative voice of the museum, I'm constantly assessing how institutions can serve performance and time-based art in general, and why performers need institutions and institutional support. How can curators be supporters of performance instead of feeding into this fear of codification and giving artists within all disciplines, not just performance, more agency in how their work is described, represented, packaged, and experienced by institutions, both for the present and the future. So I came to the kitchen after working exclusively in visual art exhibitions. As Nina mentioned, I worked at a non-collecting museum like PS1, a commercial gallery, and then a collecting museum in Europe. And I think that kind of diversity of experience has really informed my way of working, which is just a constant learning process. And it really allows for less dogmatic ways of thinking. And this works very well within the kitchen's trajectory as well. So in order to ground the examples I'll speak about a bit later on, I'll give a kind of quick overview history of the kitchen to see how we have worked and adapted to artists' needs, which of course has thus informed my curatorial practice. So this is a photo of the very first kitchen space. So the kitchen was started in 1971 by the video artist Stana and Woody Vasulka. It was started in the actual kitchen of an existing art space called the Mercer Arts Center in Soho. And, video was a very burgeoning field at that point, and they just wanted to create a physical space where artists could come together and show their work. And as you can see, it's not like a typical New York City kitchen, it's quite large. And so Stana and Woody Vasulka were really pioneers in working with video as material. And so, they were working with a lot of video processing and synthesizers. So a kind of natural collaboration disciplinarily with them was electronic musicians. So that's how the kitchen first started becoming interdisciplinary, was that, we'd have these performances of musicians, we'd show videos, people would come together, they were living locally in the neighborhood. And it was pretty casual, as you can see. We then moved into this loft space, also in Soho, in 1973. And at this point, the Vasulkas had left the kitchen in order to concentrate on being artists. They really didn't want to run an institution. And this is when the kitchen started to take a little bit more kind of institutional and curatorial shapes. So everything happened in this one space, and we had a director of sorts and curators of sorts. The curators were primarily artists like Robert Longo, who curated a lot of exhibitions, the theater artist Eric Bogosian curated dance. But, it was mainly people curating their own peers and their friends and not feeling a lot of pressure to show work that was finished or refined. And this kind of naturally grew into this extremely interdisciplinary space that we are today. So just to run through a few images, this is a Joan Jonas performance. This is actually for children. This was really early on. This is a video Conchi installation, so an example of an exhibition we've done in that space. This was the Beastie Boys when they were still a hardcore band. And I really like this photo because it's actually one of the rare photos that you see the audience in. And I think the role of the audience within performance documentation is a really interesting and absent quality usually. And this is a Simone Forti dance performance. And so after the Soho space, we moved into our present space, which is in Chelsea. When we moved from Soho to Chelsea, we were leaving a very specific kind of community of artists that were living and working in Soho and could really just, drop by on a regular basis. And we're kind of used to seeing a lot of, different types of performances in various spaces of downtown, loft spaces downtown. And so when we moved to Chelsea, we bought this building from the Dia Art Foundation. It was previously Robert Whitman's studio, the entire building of 3 floors. Before that, it was an ice factory and a movie soundstage. But so when we moved into this neighborhood, it was primarily rock clubs. There wasn't a lot of visual art around. And the other big difference when we moved in this building is that there was a black box theater, which we'd never had before, and another black box theater on top of it. So we kind of lost this interdisciplinary non-space of the loft and, really started to focus more strictly on performance that was more frontal, but also, kind of traditional in its presentation in this way, as well as trying to fit into the neighborhood more and doing more popular music, though that has always been a huge part of our programming. But, it kind of took some twists and turns from 1985 when we moved in onwards. And it somehow through that lost its vision a little bit. We were in kind of dire financial straits by the late 90s, early 2000s. And then Deb Singer, who was executive director and chief curator in the early 2000s until 2010. She came in from the Whitney Museum and really revitalized the kitchen as an institution. So the first thing she did basically was to create a gallery again, to have a contemporary art program for visual artists within the kitchen. I think for a lot of working artists, they didn't know that the kitchen was a place to have an exhibition or that we had this really strong exhibition history previously. So she built a white cube in one of the black box theaters. And so at present, we have this black box theater on the first floor, this white cube gallery within a black box theater on the second floor, and then our offices on the third floor. And so, Deb not only started this gallery program, but also introduced the concept of full-time curators to the institution, which we never had before. We were still continuing in this way where artists were basically programming at this point more within their own disciplines. So choreographers programming dance and composers programming music. And so she kind of instilled this museum structure within the kitchen. So, she's the executive director and chief curator, and then there are other full-time curators. At present, we have myself and my colleague Matthew Lyons, and then an assistant curator and archives manager as well. And we now curate between all the disciplines. We curate in the theater and the gallery, and that has, I think, absolutely changed the kind of working style and ethos of the institution and how we work with artists, which, of course, I'll get into in a little bit. But, after Deb kind of stabilized us as an institution in the mid-2000s, we entered another period, which is where kind of in the current ecosystem of New York City cultural institutions and its relationship to the market, we kind of had to look closely and see why artists want to show at the kitchen. There are just so many options for artists in New York, particularly at this point. And, we are of a scale that's large enough to appeal to more established artists, but we don't want to lose a connection to emerging artists. But then at the same time, you can have artists who are showing at the kitchen, who are also showing at MoMA, who are also showing at a blue chip gallery or an apartment gallery or a DIY music space or, maybe nowhere else at all. And that kind of mix within our own building is also really part of our ethos. And so, of course, I'm able to show you all of these images because of the kitchen's immediate recognition from the very beginning, from 1971, that we needed a record of what we were doing. And we were very lucky in this sense because we began as a video space and we had access to these tools that at that point could be very expensive or not accessible. And in a 2016 essay by David Jozelet, which was commissioned by, this is kind of a long reference, but so there was an advocacy group called Common Practice New York that was formed by a few small-scale institutions in New York City, including the kitchen. We commissioned this essay from David Jozelet to think critically about, what is our common practice as these small-scale organizations in New York. And one of the points that he made in this essay that is available on a website, if anyone's interested, I can tell you where, he coined this term instant art history. So this idea that these small-scale organizations like the kitchen, like Artist Space or White Columns, other spaces that open at the same time, but also present institutions at the scale like Triple Canopy or Participant, we all have to have this stronger focus on documentation because what we are showing is not only performance, it's not only ephemeral, but it's not part of the canon already. So, we can't rely on anyone else to do this documentation for us. And it's really crucial for us to have this archive that, as our own personal record that will then, I'm sure be rediscovered by art history students or, a gallery later on. But, I think that has really been reflected in our own approach to archiving everything and keeping everything. Our 20th Century Archive is now at the Getty Research Institute. But we do have a lot of our archive online. If you go to the kitchen's homepage and go all the way to the right, there's a tab that says archive, and it'll open up a separate site and a lot of the materials on there, which is incredible. But just as an example of, how we can offer this historical context by, being an institution that's been around for many decades, but without being mired within this history, because it's so easy to romanticize the past in this way, to look at these black and white images, to, imagine what it was like to be an avant-garde Soho artist. And it would be so easy for us to just keep, relying on that and drawing from it and never move forward and never reflect on why, what is progressive now or what is experimentation now. But I always use this example of a show we did, a retrospective of Gretchen Bender in 2013. And this retrospective included this piece called Total Recall, which is from 1987 and was originally shown at the kitchen in this very same theater. And originally when it was shown, it was a performance. So it was only shown once a night for 2 nights, and you paid your $5 and you sat down. And the video that is on these monitors is only 8 minutes long. So, she obviously wanted to change the context of watching video and, have people have a certain focus and not kind of allow for performance to be, just relegated to bodies in this way. And, she's someone who is very much aligned, I think, at the time with the kind of the pictures generation of artists, but she was investing in media and kind of like the corporatization of media in a way that was quite different from those artists. And so she did this show at the kitchen. She had many other kind of, successful shows, but then she, couldn't afford to make her work anymore. This was, if you look at this is like 24 monitors and 3 screens, and all the work she made was really like on this level of ambition. And she became a television commercial director primarily, and she also made music videos. And I think probably her most viewed work is the title credits for America's Most Wanted, which are really amazing if you go back and look at them again. But, so like this condition of her kind of leaving the art world also, kind of didn't allow for a certain care to be attended to her work. And so she died quite young, when she was in her 40s. We had her memorial at the kitchen. Like, that's kind of how close we were with her. But, when she died, like her work was in her studio, wasn't preserved at all. Much of it was kind of rotted. She was working with all this new technology, like laser discs that would rot within sculptures, or even some of her work that went to the Mint Museum in North Carolina, like, because it was really just looked after by one curator who really cared about her work, and then that curator left. Like, no one was looking after her work there, and the process of putting together this retrospective, which we did with the artist Philip van der Heijden and Michelle Grabner from the Suburban outside of Chicago, it was like a real like labor of love in terms of the kind of care they had to put into the research and the remastering of all this work. And we basically put this work together by looking at video documentation that the kitchen had of this piece, but we had no idea like how it was put together. We were just like looking at photos and rearranging the televisions, and talking to her close friends, which were Robert Longo and Cindy Sherman, and the composer Stuart Argabright, her former assistant, Rick Wright-Tiravanija. So all these people who still had these like very strong memories, but of course, like, there was nothing in writing. And so by recreating this work, we kind of created this whole new system for how it ran. We built a computer for it because originally it was run off of all VCRs that you had to press play at one time. And we tried to replicate that with DVDs, and it really didn't work. And we were running this as an exhibition. Like, there was so much work put into this that we couldn't really justify doing it as a 1 or 2 night performance. We showed it, within an exhibition context. We showed it once an hour on the hour, on our regular gallery schedule. And so we needed something that was really reliable, and so we built this computer, and that kind of allowed the piece to travel. It went to the Hammer afterwards, it went to the Tate Liverpool, and now it's owned by the Met, it was acquired by the Met in 2015. So, this kind of just rebuilding from our own archival footage became like really crucial to the kind of recovery efforts made around her work. And I think now she's finally getting the recognition that she deserves after, many decades of neglect in that way. But so I'm going to kind of like move upwards through the building now with the examples I'm going to show. So Gretchen's show really inspired I think it's the only new commission of visual artists we've done in the theater since then, which you probably recognize from all of the posters, is Sarah Magenheimer, a project I did with Sarah Magenheimer called I Collect Neglected Venoms last year. And I know some of you also saw this in real life with Vic when she visited, which is great. And so Sarah is an artist who is really comfortable in both visual and performing arts realms. She started as, like when she was quite young, as a touring punk musician. And then she went to art school and started making video and sound art. And she, when I approached her to do an exhibition, I think she always imagined it as being in the theater. And so, we were able to give her residency time within the theater to kind of figure out how to work within the space. And we talked a lot about how are we going to rearrange the risers? As you can see there, this is a very frontal presentation. Are we going to install the theater like a gallery in terms of being able to walk around things? And in the end, we decided that it was really best to stick with this kind of traditional theater format. And so, as a viewer, you would walk into this room. There are scent diffusers, which are the kind of illuminated objects in there. There's a 2-channel video that was about 17 minutes long. There's a fish tank in the middle of the stage, and there's a live feed of video of the fish tank on the back wall. And then there's this kind of like, exaggerated performance area with like dozens of microphones that are obviously not necessary. But so we would show the video on a loop throughout the gallery hours, and then she did an opening and closing performance in which she would kind of appear and reappear in that performance area and kind of give vocal, she would like talk over the video or sing over the video and kind of amplify the language that was in the video, which is very poetic and also very funny. And this was, kind of our first experiment in doing this type of theater installation, exhibition. And it was only able to be up for, I think it was only up for 10 days because of the limitations of the theater in terms of its schedule. And so that's like, as much as we try to kind of mix up these spaces, there are these really technical limitations, schedule limitations, like all sorts of things that aren't allowing us to be as flexible as we would necessarily imagine. But at the same time, I think these kind of these limitations do create something really valuable. Like this idea that you don't have to make a theater look like a gallery in order to have an exhibition within it, or you don't have to kind of change how people are experiencing the video in order to like make it feel theatrical, or it's kind of I think that those limitations have really been quite generative for the curators and for the artists. But that kind of working in between disciplines for the curators allows us to have these shared dialogues between the disciplines, but also allows us to create new audiences within that. And I think this question of interdisciplinary audiences for us has been kind of, again, at the forefront of our minds because, when I first got to the kitchen, which was almost 8 years ago, we had very strict audiences for dance, music, performance, and visual arts. So we had people who were coming to see music who had no idea we did dance, and we had people coming to the gallery who had no idea we had a theater, even though that was so inherent to our own history that it seems kind of impossible that you wouldn't kind of recognize, all these different things that were happening in the building. And so one of the strategies that we took on to create this new more integrated audience was to start a series called Lab, which stands for Language, Art, and Bodies. And so this is a series in which we invite usually 3 or 4 artists from different disciplines to come together once a month and speak about one specific term for the duration of the year. So there are different artists at each talk, but the term is the same. So the first year we spoke about presence. Second year we did audience. We've done narrative, position, and the current season is the term is relation, specifically speaking to Edouard Glissant's poetics of relation. So, this is an opportunity for artists from different disciplines not only to meet each other and speak to each other and share work with each other, but also to see how this shared language, kind of translates between each discipline and how these disciplines see, see the word position, see the word relation. And it's, sometimes it's kind of a failure, sometimes it's really difficult, and sometimes it's extremely beneficial. And so one of the more beneficial outcomes of this has been my work with Tina Satter and the theater company Half Straddle. And so Tina is someone who participated in the very first lab series on presence, and she wrote this monologue about presence that then grew into this evening-length work called Ancient Lives, which you can see here. And so, as many artists do, she has come back and worked with us many times, and we wanted to have a greater focus on the lab last year and do this kind of conference with the commissions, with artists who kind of acknowledged that lab had an effect on their process and their practice in general. So Tina was one of those artists, and so I gave her the choice for this lab commission to work in the gallery of the theater. And she chose the gallery. And she chose the gallery in order for people to experience her work in new ways, to have a new connection to her audience. But instead of presenting the gallery as a studio or work in progress or, kind of a more typical rehearsal that you would just stumble into, she kind of made this highly aestheticized installation that functioned as a fully realized set for her work. It was designed by her set designer, Parker Lutz, who's worked at the kitchen many times, but never in the gallery. She worked in this space when it was a black box theater. But so the project really, I think it was a residency that was 2 weeks long in the gallery, but Tina kind of, anytime she's given an opportunity, she really delves into it and takes advantage of it as much as possible. So I'm just going to read you how she described the project, since she's a playwright, and having performers speak for themselves is also kind of part of the documentation question. But she described it as an open work period and colloquy that encompasses rehearsals and showings of new theater and video work, the launch of an online journal of performance writing, public lectures, and communal zine-making activities that will act as accessible discussion periods. The work, which is, the whole thing was called Here I Go, Part 2 of You. The work engages company members, peers, and their artistic heroes to expand critical artistic discourse, to interrogate and reflect on how we codify, and to consider why various performances are made and ask what their making means at this time. So basically for each night of this 10-day period, there were 2 to 3 lectures with kind of musical interludes in between, and then we'd all have drinks and eat marshmallows afterwards. And the lectures included playwrights, writers, and performers, such as, kind of younger playwrights such as Brendan Jacob Jenkins or Casey Llewellyn, but then also writers like Sarah Schulman and Jennifer Krasinski. I also spoke. Claudia Rankin was supposed to speak, but there was a snowstorm. So kind of a wide swath of this downtown interdisciplinary scene. But just wanted to read more of how she described this. So she said, and there's a whole trope of performative, quote unquote, lectures. And even with some of the incredible performers and artists I'd invited to speak, the whole idea was that we got to hear their thoughts, ideas, questions, etc., from a bit more of a clearly defined intellectual standpoint. And since we're mostly a theater company, I think there were some questions at first if we were doing a quotation of a lecture series, and we were not. The room and design and aesthetics of all the elements were tended to in the way we'd tend to a performance, because I could not let go of that aspect of presenting something, but all that design and aesthetic consideration and the tiny bit of live music before and after lectures was to frame this almost old-fashioned idea of a lecture presented by a quote-unquote public figure. And here I really like just how Tina acknowledges she wasn't able to let go of these certain conditions that would allow her to work, how she felt comfortable. But for the gallery goers, because this was just open during the day, as a regular gallery exhibition, and sometimes there'd be rehearsals, sometimes, there wouldn't be anything, sometimes there'd just be someone sitting in a robe wanting to talk to you. The gallery goers were so freaked out and confused, and they didn't know what to look at. And there was art on the walls, but they weren't sure if they were supposed to sit down or talk to someone. And this kind of like alien environment, I think, also really allowed for the speakers to feel really comfortable, kind of speaking frankly. There was not a real prompt necessarily. Like, it was about feminist practice in one sense, but it was also just about like your kind of place in the system and like how identity plays into that. And I think people were really open in a way that felt very remarkable. And I think it was like, even though it was a public space, like I think this highly controlled environment that looked like a theater set made people feel quite safe in that way. And I think that was really key to Tina's thinking around it as well. So I'm going to move on to an example of a visual artist doing their first performative work in a gallery, which is a show by Yann Vu and the band Shushu called Metal in 2014. So Yann is a really fantastic example of a really established artist who came to the kitchen with something that he couldn't do anywhere else. And so, I always say that when I first heard that Yann was going to do a project at the kitchen, I was just like, what is someone going to do here in this kind of scrappy, small space that they couldn't do he just had so many exhibition opportunities. He showed at every museum in the world. He shows with a blue chip gallery. What opportunities does this person not have as an artist? And so what ended up happening was that he invited the rock, experimental rock band Shushu, led by Jamie Stewart, to collaborate on this project with him. And they had previously collaborated on a one-night performance at the Walker the year before. And I think that Yann really just wanted to push the performative aspects of his work for this. Often artists do that when they're invited to the kitchen. They're really thinking about how to expand their the performative elements within their kind of static work. But this show always takes a lot of levels of explaining. So this exhibition, this performance itself was an installation in which you would have the band Shushu playing all percussion instruments, so all metal instruments. Jamie Stewart wrote I think 52 short compositions, so ranging from kind of really composed, kind of new music scores to things that are kind of more fluxus, there was a piece where they just put vibrators all over their instruments and let them play for 3 minutes, or they would throw a gong in the air or gong or a cymbal in the air, and someone else in the band would put a butterscotch candy in a slingshot and try to hit the gong. And so while that was happening, they're performing, they're working as musicians. While that was happening, there were 2 gold pounders from Thailand working, so you can see them in the background. And these 2 gold pounders are from a workshop that makes the gold leaf for Yann Vu's sculptures. So this is a workshop he's worked with for years. This is actually a father-son duo. So the process of turning gold into gold leaf is this kind of repetitive pounding that takes about 3 hours to do, kind of I can't remember the exact dimensions, but kind of this cube of gold. And so these gold pounders were also working every day in the gallery, but they were also performing, completely taken out of their normal workday context. And so, I think the temporalities of performance within this show were really evident, obviously. So there's like the performance of like, and temporality of labor, This is a working day for them. It was from 12 to 3 every day. This also affected the way the entire building of the kitchen worked. So like my office is right above the Gold Pounders. And so from 12 to 3, I would just write really efficient emails and, not do a lot of thinking, but just kind of like all the practical work. And then after they stop, I do a little more conceptual work. But it also affected the, people rehearsing in the theater. Like we had to rearrange the entire theater schedule to kind of avoid the noise that was being made from this show. You also had the temporality of a gallery exhibition. So, Yann being the extremely accomplished artist that he was by 2014, he had many collectors who were coming to this show thinking it was a completely normal show and having a symbol thrown at them or a chair thrown at them, not on purpose, but just that was the performance. And then you also had the temporality of a rock show, or a music club, because Shushu has a really dedicated following. And the idea that, this band was playing a free show every day for 3 hours for a month was this really unique opportunity to have this extreme, very extreme proximity to this kind of cult figure that Jamie Stewart is. And, we'd have his fans show up in Shushu t-shirts and just sit down for 3 hours and just listen to it as music. So this was a really kind of remarkable conflation of all this, all these things that we do at the kitchen. And, it was also this type of kind of institutional rebellion or refusal on Yann's part, because at the same time that he had this show, he did a presentation with the Public Art Fund of his We the People series, which is these casts of the different parts of Statue of Liberty. And so those were installed in these parks all over the city. And he, when you install work in the city, on city land, on city property, there are so many rules and regulations. He wasn't allowed to refer to a certain piece as the armpit of the Statue of Liberty because that was offensive. There was just all these things he couldn't do. And then, of course, with any public art, you have to make it really durable. It has to have a feel of permanence, has to be kind of indestructible. So to do this while that was also happening in the same city was this kind of, for him, I think he just thought it was hilarious. And he would just kind of come to the, he wasn't installing anything necessarily. He would just come to the exhibition and laugh at what he had created, and just also think it was really out of control and remarkable in this way that he had never been allowed to do in a museum necessarily. And I know we're running short on time, so I'm just going to very briefly mention Annika Heidlas' show, since I know her work is being installed here, and this was such an important show for both Annika and I. And, this is not an exhibition that's performative, but just addressed a lot of these same issues around disappearance and the challenges of documentation in general. So this was a work, an exhibition we did in 2015 called You Can Call Me F. And, I invited Annika to work with the kitchen at a time when she already had 2 other institutional shows planned. So one was the MIT list show, which was the piece was acquired by this museum, and then she had a show at Kunsthal Basel right afterwards. So my invitation to her kind of came at a time when she had a lot on her plate already, but she really wanted to do a show in her hometown of New York and kind of reconsider her work as time-based work, consider sculpture as time-based work. And she's someone who, is really thinking about how art is dominated by sight, which is thought to be objective. And so she works with smell and fragrance a lot because it is very subjective. and thus thought to be very feminine. She works with a lot of unstable materials, as I'm sure a lot of you know from the acquisition of this piece here. And so this kind of responsiveness that she had to do, because she had to do the show kind of quicker than all the other ones, but also knew that the kitchen was receptive to failure and experimentation. So when we were talking about the conception of this show, there were two things that were really occupying her mind. And so one was, how do you visibly, kind of like perceptively represent a network of women, which is her support system in the art world? Like this idea that, she was only able to get to where she was, or, and I was only able to get to where I am, like through the support of other women. So that being collectors, dealers, writers, anyone that she had contact with, studio assistants, interns. And so that was also at the same time as this extreme paranoia around Ebola entering New York City was just ever present. Like every day you were just hearing these reports about how much closer Ebola was getting to New York, and like, don't touch the subway pole. And, this doctor came back from working with Ebola patients, and then he went to a bar in Williamsburg and like went to the movies, and then came down with Ebola, and everyone was like not allowed to go to that bar anymore. There's just like, this really intense paranoia around the body. And so like she kind of combined all of these aspects into this one work, which we made, a lot of people made this work. We made it with 100 women by collecting their bacteria from saliva samples, from anywhere you want to put a Q-tip. She just had a team of studio assistants collecting this, and we made it. She was working at MIT with a microbiologist named Tal Janino, and he synthesized all of this into one kind of like super bacteria, which she then used to make this enormous Petri dish billboard of the title of her show, which was the first thing you saw at the kitchen when you entered the gallery. It was completely dark, other than this illuminated, kind of disgusting giant Petri dish that was growing every day and festering. And, it was very kind of like, it really was this embodiment of all of that kind of bacterial paranoia that we had at that moment. But once you moved into the gallery, you saw these quarantine tents that she made that were each kind of their own like ecosystem of materials and sculptures that she had made. So these are the quarantine tents that were kind of modeled after the tents you'd have to live in once you returned from working with Ebola patients at like the Newark airport or other places in the city. But within these tents, you can see in the background there are these kind of sheets, and they're kombucha mothers. They're dried kombucha mothers. And then there are these slowly rotating motorcycle helmets. And the motorcycle helmets were emitting a scent of Gagosian gallery. So she was thinking, what is the ultimate, white, male, patriarchal, Western smell? And that is Gagosian gallery. And that smell, paradoxically is nothing at all. Like, it doesn't smell like anything, because the entire point of, luxury and, making people sorry is to like get people away from notions of the body, to never have to think about the body in this way. And so while people were, walking into the gallery and seeing this Petri dish and kind of imagining the smell, actually the Petri dish didn't smell at all. It was very contained. What they were smelling was Gagosian, and just like imagining this like, terrifying female smell. But this Gagosian smell was covering everything else up, which I thought was just this really brilliant move on her part. And if people are wondering how she got that smell, she worked with the artist Sean Raspit, who has a company where he synthetically replicates scent and works with that. He currently has an exhibition at Bridget Donahue Gallery before, and has also showed at the kitchen many years ago before he was making scent work. But and they just walked into the gallery and were able to kind of like capture the scent in this kind of like bomb-looking type apparatus, and then synthetically replicate it. And I'm always hoping there is a security video of that somewhere, because I would really love to see it. But I mean, as you can see, and as I'm sure you know from the acquisition of Annika's piece, I mean, this entire exhibition took an enormous amount of maintenance, an enormous amount of care. You know, the Petri dish condenses or has condensation every night and kind of blocks the view of the bacteria. So we had to like rig a heating system for it that was made out of like 2 mic stands and space heaters. There were, you know, all these elements in the tents that were constantly drying out and had to be watered, or had to kind of be like propped up again because they would melt from the lights. You know, we had to refill the perfume dispensers on a regular basis. I mean, there was just so much kind of like care and maintenance just embedded into the exhibition. And I think that was, you know, a major kind of teaching moment for all of us at the kitchen, because we'd never done something done this type of maintenance on such an enormous scale. And I forgot to mention that we made that Petri dish at the kitchen. And then part of my job as a curator was to convince everyone that it was not going to kill them with black mold. And we just made it in our wood shop. And we all put like hazmat suits and masks on. But I think I'm going to stop it there and just open it up for questions. I know this is a lot of information and a lot of examples. But does anyone have any questions? Hopefully. Oh, I'll go you first. Or sorry, yes, you. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, when you were talking about working with Yann Vu, or sort of like artists that have opportunity to show at, you know, all the museums that you could think of, how do you find out what it is that those other spaces aren't giving them? Is it just a matter of sort of open support, or do you have like an idea of their work and then you kind of shape that, or do they come to you with a brand new proposal and you're sort of helping that along?
I think it's usually a combination of all of those things. I think it's, you know, it's definitely an awareness of what they've been making, and something that you can like sense within the work that can grow in a specific direction. But there's a lot of, you know, I think most artists come into an institution thinking that like there's not, you know, just space-wise, there's not necessarily like resources to offer them that aren't immediately apparent. So it's like, you know, you can go into a museum and be like, this is a beautiful space, like architecturally, but like, you know, at the kitchen, it's a lot of saying like, we have these human resources, for example, we have these tech specialists who's, you know, our tech crew mainly works in the theaters. So like when you're doing an exhibition, they kind of apply a lot of theatrical knowledge to that installation. You know, you can say like utilize the sound system in a way that you've never been able to at a museum, because, you know, everything you wanted to do has been too loud, or, you know, have a strobe light, or, you know, like have an entire lighting cycle that runs during your exhibition, you know, all these kind of aspects. And just, yeah, it's a long conversation about like what kinds of support you can offer them that aren't financial, basically. You know, like you know, with someone like Yann, it's like he has a lot of collectors and a lot of financial backing, but like if you kind of like take those things away, like what else can we do if it's not about production or fabrication?
Mm-hmm. Yes. I was really interested in what you were saying about sort of the problem of the archive, mm-hmm. right? And that there are certain kinds of things that lend themselves to necessary documentation, like photography or lists or different kinds of things, or labels and things, and those are, you know, tropes and can become cliches of representation or documentation. And I'm wondering how the kitchen is thinking in an experimental way about the archive. How do you do those things that you kind of like have to do in order to have that photograph of that in, 30, 40 years will be romanticized, right? Like the way
Right.
we look at the black and white photo. And then also deal with the kind of experimental nature of the place, and in working with artists and their inherent problems with some of the ways that things are documented. Like you were suggesting that artists don't necessarily like the way. Do you have some kind of idea of like the new archive or?
Yeah.
What does that look like for you?
I mean, I think that, like, as I mentioned, like, yeah, the way we treat things is very traditional because I think, part of it is like, I don't think we have like the resources to have like 10 cameras and, like do a separate shoot for performance. Like that's something like a lot of people ask for is like, oh, can we just do a shoot that's for the camera and not for an audience? Like, we can't do those kinds of things. But in determining kind of like how that archive is utilized and like allowing artists to have control over that, I think is really important to us. Like we definitely make a case for documenting everything. There are a lot of artists, particularly musicians, that don't want any documentation. I think just because of like, the ability for music to be leaked or shared, and it has come up many times. And you're like, okay, well, you're becoming part of this institutional archive. It's not just about like the record, but it is about this kind of like looking back. And so like we can just lock it up in the vault for decades and no one will ever see it and you'll have complete control over using it. And I think that that kind of small concession has made just a really big difference in like what artists will allow for and like how they kind of see our archive. But, a big part of this kind of like language around performance and how things are kind of presented to the public is that we are really open to how artists themselves want to be marketed. And so, it's like if an artist doesn't want a press release, we're not going to write a press release. If they don't want any description on the website, they don't have to have any, like, and that will continue like in perpetuity. So like if they want that one performance or an exhibition to have like only been seen by the people who were there, that's fine, and only understood by the people there, that's also fine. And I think that, it always sounds so silly that it's just like marketing, but it actually makes this like enormous difference in how things are preserved. And I think that has been a real point of conflict with a lot of performance and performing artists and museums, is that like there always has to be this really clear description. There has to be, this really digestible way of describing things and identifying things. And I think that's something that like as more institutions do that, we're just kind of like taking it away.
Can I just follow up with
yeah.
that? So I'm sorry, but conversely, on the other side of that, like rather than sort of the artist saying like, I want less information, right? I want the work to exist in sort of a different or on its own terms. Have there been things that artists have wanted in terms of documentation or wanted in terms of how their work is presented that you guys can do that's sort of doing something different than what a regular museum can do? Instead of like, we're not going to do those regular things, like what are we doing?
Yeah, I think a lot of that lies, I don't know, I think the kind of natural progression from that would be like what an audience experience would be, and like how that is recorded and preserved, because I think that is where artists feel like there is a lack, is like, how it is remembered in like a personal archive of an audience member who saw it. Like, how is that expressed? And I think it's something that hasn't been resolved yet, and it's something that we talk about a lot, but like haven't quite figured it out. So yes, I think there's a lot that we can't offer at this point with our own just like resources, and we've just been just historically just saved everything, like, in terms of like a garage or something. Like it's like we don't know what's going to be important, so we'll just save everything that way. Is you first? Yeah. Oh, yeah.
To what degree has the act of restaging, not by way of documentation as in the Bender piece, but by way of live replication, how has this come up in your discussions with artists in continually building this new archive that you speak of? Like, I keep thinking about like a kind of, like the first thought that came to mind was the potential of it to slip into the realm of theater, but I feel like your institution is built upon this kind of slippage or this blurring of the lines between all of these different contexts. So do you think that there's some potential there for restaging future iterations, or do you think that's something that's decided on a case-by-case basis?
I think it's really decided on a case-by-case basis. I've yet to have a single artist like approach me about that, which I think is really interesting. You know, I think it's like, particularly for the work they make at the kitchen, they feel like it is site-specific. It is really tied to the history of the kitchen, or it's tied to the architecture. It's, you know, it's just rooted in that, even if, I don't know if there's not necessarily like anything within the work that like explicitly speaks about that, but, you know, also this idea of reperformance, you know, it's like I have to kind of separate all of this out of my mind because, like, you know, there are artists, performing artists are reperform their work on a regular basis. So it's just like, you know, why does performance art have to, like, why is that considered like reperformance rather than just like staging the performance, you know? And like, so I think because we are equally rooted in performing arts, like this is not as much of a question. But there's certainly like choreographers that we work with who like don't want their work to live on beyond them at all. You know, like that's something they've clearly kind of stated, just like when I die, the work just dies.
Okay.
Yeah, I would love to follow up just a little bit in the direction that I think you were going. You mentioned before the idea of some of the archival photos not including the audience. I would love to hear you comment a little bit more on that. And maybe as a follow-on, perhaps to that, maybe some thoughts about visitor photography and social media as part of the art.
Sure, absolutely. I think David Levine was here earlier this year working with performance documentation. He's made this performance audience the subject of his work, and you know, just like going through all these archival photos of seminal 70s performance and like isolating views of the audience. But it is, you know, it's like this idea that documentation is always supposed to be this kind of like objective view, so that it's not, it can't, I don't know, it's just always positioned so that the audience is not part of it. And I think, and that poses a lot of problems, even like, you know, when we document dress rehearsals, for example, like we always do photography at dress rehearsals, but that means there's no audience there. And then sometimes that makes just an enormous difference with how you see the work. And I haven't really seen that change so much because, I don't know, I think this is just like this way of documenting that's like more objective, even though it's not at all. Of course, it is like situated in a very specific place. But I think the role of social media with that is so important because everyone is clearly authoring their work in this way. And I have learned so much from looking at social media posts of my exhibitions and like seeing what people focus on and how they are experiencing things. And I think that's really valuable. And, you know, when I first started working at the kitchen almost 8 years ago, we didn't allow for any personal photography in the gallery. And I don't know how long that lasted, but it was very difficult to control. And people definitely had iPhones in 2011, I think. Yeah. So, you know, just this kind of, exponential growth around like documenting your experience at an exhibition is, I find it like incredibly fascinating, because the kitchen is, for example, like the kitchen is across the street from David Zwirner Gallery. And since I've worked at the kitchen, I think there's been 4 different Yayoi Kusama shows. And the line for that grows in just the most insane ways every single time she has a show. I mean, it looks like by the time I get to work at 10 a.m., there are people who've been there since 6 a.m. waiting, for the gallery to open. Usually I think the waiting time is 3 to 4 hours, and the limit to how long you can be in the gallery is something like 30 seconds or something like that. And it's just like everyone's experience is just rooted in that documentation. Like there's no reason to go to the show unless it's documented. And I try to stay really positive about that. But I never prevent people from like sharing work on social media, though it is, performance-wise, it gets a little bit difficult. Or a lot difficult. And as a curator, you can't control it that much when every performance curator in New York is also doing it, So it's kind of like, we're all sharing in this like decision around like what is appropriate and not as documentation in that way. And I'm like very excited and scared to see where that all goes. Is that the last question? Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone.